We need to deal for a moment here with something kind of historic, I think, a kind of just what it was like to be a gay person through several decades. Because I think a lot of people don't have a clue right now, including an enormous number of gay people.
The institutions that prevented people from being themselves, gay people, were the world of employment, where you would easily lose a job for even saying you were gay. There were teachers losing their jobs. Of course, if you worked anywhere near children, that was considered awful. They were assuming that all gays are pederasts, which we know is not true. The religious environment, the state environment, there were no laws protecting us as to our employment or our housing or anything else. So every way we turned, society was opposed to us, including certainly the police. You know, I myself had an experience where I was picked up in an unlikely place, and the police found us and asked for all my money in order not to report me. So experiences like that give a person less confidence, less belief in the system that they live by. They understand that there is a world beyond the system. And if they have enough, the old word is gumption, they can make their own way in the world. There were laws against cross-dressing because they appealed back to some old law about masquerading, which I think dates back to something like the Boston Tea Party. They had rules such as if you were in a bar, you had to face the bar. You couldn't unbutton your shirt more than the top button. They didn't serve drinks in places where homosexuals were known to congregate. You couldn't dance with another man. There had to be a woman present, which led to ridiculous things on Fire Island, such as 7 men dancing the Madison with 1 woman. It was a line dance, so they threw her in the line. And, you know, there are ways always around the law.
Many people today don't realize how different gay life was before Stonewall and the gay movement. I was born and raised in the 1940s in York, Pennsylvania, which is a small blue-collar town in southern Pennsylvania. And I didn't know anybody who was gay. I honestly thought that I was the only gay person in the world. And I was afraid that if anybody knew about it, I would be beaten up or killed. And it was a terrible thing to do to young people. And many people of my generation grew up in isolation. There was no sense of community at all. The popular arts, the popular culture, things like movies and things like that, even if they were homophobic, actually helped a little bit because they reminded us that there were other gay people in the world, which was a big eye-opener for me to realize that. And things that we take for granted today, like going to an audience which is mostly gay and seeing a gay-positive movie, that would have been a revolutionary experience when I was a young person. Or turning on television and seeing gay-positive characters, that was a revolutionary experience. Or being able to walk down the street and hold hands with a person of the same sex and have people smile and wish you well, that would have been totally unheard of. I grew up during the Eisenhower era, and that was a time of morose conformity. It was like living in a nation of sheep. After President Kennedy came into office, new energies came to the surface, not necessarily because of him, but coincidentally. And as a result, there was fights against the war in Vietnam, struggles against the war in Vietnam, the struggle for civil rights for African Americans, women's struggle, all these different struggles, and that was in the air all the time. You would turn on a television screen and you would see these images of people standing up and say, "In the name of justice, I fight back." And that happened again and again. And so it kind of sank into the consciousness of the popular culture. What happened in New York City was that the organized crime was very deeply entrenched in the gay bar scene. And the organized crime was divided among competing families, and they sometimes warred on each other over turf, money, and profits. And so what they would do was they would get their friends in the police department to raid bars that belonged to another family in organized crime that they were competing with. We call the police who did this the mafia in blue. because they were basically acting as tools for the economic exploitation of gay people. And this was a regular thing. Bars were raided all the time, and the only way that you could get even a semblance of protection against this was to have a bar that was owned by an extremely powerful mafia person who would pay to keep the cops out and who could fend off rival families in the syndicate. That's the protection we had. So it was better than nothing, but it was not liberation.
Just like white supremacy, which was overthrown by black people and their white allies, white supremacy covered every aspect of life for a black person. The same way for women, male supremacy, which was overthrown by women and their male allies, covered every aspect of a woman's life. We're dealing here with a situation of heterosexual supremacy. It's the same concept. And so we have a systemic and ubiquitous system in operation here that oppresses gay people and has to continue oppressing gay people. So that we're dealing here with something which is much more pervasive than just the list of oppressions. We're dealing with something that did not validate us as human beings. At that time, we were labeled as psychopathological by the American Psychiatric Association. The church, no matter which church, with few exceptions, the Quakers and the Mennonites, labeled us as sinful. Legally, there were laws on the books in every state defining us as a legal violation, so that wherever we looked, there was something in place to denigrate us and to lessen ourselves as human beings. So you're dealing with a situation where heterosexual supremacy ruled. Since that time, in the last 40 years, we've gotten a little breathing space. We've gotten a clearing in the forest where hopefully gay people can breathe openly and freely, and we can begin to overthrow the remainder of heterosexual supremacy. On the books in virtually every state, certainly true in California, were laws that there could be no same-sex showing of affection in public. And so when undercover police went into gay bars, they were looking for gay people putting their arms around each other, touching each other affectionately. And those were the people who were targeted by the vice cop. And so if there were 100 people in the bar, they would arrest 15 of them as a show of trying to intimidate the rest of them.
In a gay bar, you couldn't dance with another man. There was a girl at the center, and then there was a circle around the girls. And you would go to clubs like Ondine's, which was below the 59th Street Bridge, and you could dance, guys in a circle, all coming from the Metropolitan Opera, all dressed in black tuxedos, dancing around Edie Sedgwick, okay? Wearing a strut because a foot was broken, dancing on that strut, and all the boys with the curly hair and the big velvet ties would all be dancing in a circle. If you got too close to another boy, there was a man on a ladder, a mafiosi, generally a fat Italian mafiosi, who would shine a flashlight on you. And if he shined the flashlight on you twice, they would call the police, and the police would come in and arrest you. You would go to jail. You know, it was like, you know, and every gay bar had the same talent. That law was on the books.
You know, Harry Hay, one time I met Harry Hay. I had dinner with him with Ethan Ghetto, and Harry Hay is the founder of the Mattachine Society and the Radical Fairies. And I just remember so clearly him saying that we made a huge mistake in the movement when we started talking about assimilation, and we're just like you. We're only just different here. We're just like you. And he said, we're not just like them. There is something different about us and something unique that we contribute to the culture, to the society, to the species. And without that, the rest of the culture is bereft. They have no idea how urgently, how desperately they need us.
The American Psychological Association listed homosexuality as a mental illness. They finally were persuaded by a little political action when one of their meetings was disrupted by angry gay people, to look at the gay side and to see that every gay is not mentally disturbed. There was a psychologist named Evelyn Hooker who was one of the first to get the story from gay people themselves. While everyone was telling her that gays were sick, gays were telling her that they had perfectly well-adjusted lives. They just happened to be gay. It took a long time for society to hear that, but she brought that message back to the psychologist world, and gays reinforced it with their political demonstrations. And soon the list of disorders was changed so that it became, if you are unhappy with your sexuality, or you are gender dysphoric and unhappy about it, then that's the problem. But being gay in itself is not a problem.
The Mattachine Society and what ushered in what they called the Homophile effort was generally a fairly conservative activity. It was based on not rocking the boat. It was based on, if we show them how good and how kind we are, they will emancipate us, in a sense. So the Homophile effort was largely an emancipation movement.
By the mid-60s, there was a very activist branch of the Mattachine Society, which was founded by a guy named Frank Kameny. And then from the mid-1960s on, they were leading protest marches in front of the White House, in front of the Pentagon, Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So while that militant orientation hadn't spread widely yet, it was beginning. It had already spread to San Francisco, where they had very activist-oriented groups by the mid-1960s. The gay rights movement is often looked at in terms of before Stonewall and after Stonewall, and that's an oversimplification. It was more complex than that. There was already a shift because there was a shift in society, because of the Vietnam War, because of black civil rights, because of women's rights. There had been a shift toward more militant political organizations. Stonewall blew it open for gay people in a lot of ways, but there was more of a transition than we like to acknowledge.
I was still in the closet and dating a woman whom I had taught with, and I was on my way home from such a date on a Saturday night when I saw the crowd in front of the Stonewall. The first night, I believe, was a Friday. I saw a crowd there. I had no idea what it was. I never knew it was a gay bar. I never went to gay bars. And so I stood there for a couple of minutes and watched this crowd, and nothing much seemed to be happening, so I just went on home. It wasn't until I read about it in the Village Voice the following week, in which I think it was Lucian Truscott IV described the forces of faggotry standing up to the police, which is a mixed blessing kind of statement. Stonewall soon became our rallying cry. Once I got into the movement, we saw how important Stonewall had been, because that week the Gay Liberation Front was founded. The gay political movement had its origins back in the 1950s with the Mattachine Society, and even earlier groups like the Society for Individual Rights in Chicago. But the main post-Stonewall activity was in the first few years of the 1970s.
The Stonewall Riot was unique because it engendered an energy that lived beyond itself and that became formalized and institutionalized. There were riots, gay riots, before Stonewall. There was one in San Francisco. But they were flashes in the pan. Nothing really followed. Stonewall was unique because this tremendous riot happened, but the energy didn't stop. The energy continued even beyond the original participants. The energy became channeled into organizations which carried on the spirit of Stonewall. The first was the Gay Liberation Front. If there had been no follow-through after Stonewall, it would have been a very interesting fluke. But because there was follow-through, Stonewall started a revolution, and the revolution still continues. I was not at the Stonewall riot itself, but from talking to friends of mine who were, and who are now dead, they recounted that the police raided the bar late at night. The patrons unexpectedly to everyone, including the patrons, and especially the police, decided to fight back. And eventually the police ended up being locked inside the bar. There was a fear on the police that the patrons who were now outside would set fire to the bar with the cops inside. Fortunately, we are a nonviolent people, and that didn't happen. The Snake Pit was a bar that existed in New York City that was a pretty grim place. And I believe it was in March of 1970 or so, as best as I can recall. A raid was made on the Snake Pit. And there was one person there, Diego Vanales, who was a native of South America, I think Venezuela, but I'm not sure. And he was afraid that if he were arrested, he would be sent back to his country and terrible things would happen to him. So he panicked. He jumped out a window and he landed on an iron fence below, and he impaled himself on the iron fence. And he was arrested along with a section of the iron fence, which was cut out from the fence and taken with him. He survived. What happened in the long run after that, I don't know, in terms of his own personal fortunes. But Marty Robinson said, no matter how you look at it, Diego Vanales was pushed. I'm sorry. And so we pushed back. So Diego Vanales was a terrible, terrible example of how homophobia was killing people. And many of us could recount things that were not as deadly, but which snuffed out people's lives. After the Snake Pit incident and the demonstration that we had against it, there was a very large influx of new people coming into the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance.
Someone gave me this leaflet, which disturbed me a lot. Like, why would they give this to me? Don't I look straight enough? But thank goodness for gaydar. So I got it, and I took a straight couple with me as camouflage, and we watched this demonstration, and watching it changed my life because I heard them yelling, "Say it loud, gay is proud," and I realized that's true. You know, I couldn't deny that any longer. What is gay liberation? Gay liberation, as far as I can define it, is mostly a matter of self-respect for gay people. It's not buying into the things that society has said about us. And these days, society says less of that. So young people coming up don't have to hear it. They hear it from some people. They hear "that's so gay" from their schoolmates. The word faggot is still bandied about. And so each person still has to find his way or her way. But, and the suicide rate still remains higher than the straight world. But gay liberation is us taking the reins into our own hands and driving, this is an awful metaphor, the stagecoach, but you know, doing the driving ourselves and deciding what is our history and what isn't, not what other people make is our history. In the early days of gay liberation, there was no arguing with us. We were angry people, and we had just discovered this injustice that society had perpetrated on us. Many of us didn't even realize it before then, that you know, our place in the scheme of things didn't have to be what it was. We were entitled to full recognition as citizens, and so we egged each other on.
I had met my first lover, Arthur Bell, in 1964. After moving to New York City. We never lived together, which was a good thing because we were as different as two people could be. I think in retrospect that sex is nature's way of making people who have nothing in common spend time together. That was certainly the case here. But there's a positive thing to that too as well, because even though there are conflicts, sex encourages us to deal with people that we might not otherwise deal with. And that builds community and adhesiveness, as Walt Whitman called it. We had our own relationship, and we had a relationship with other gay couples and that was it. We didn't go to the bars. We didn't participate in much that happened. When I became a graduate student at Columbia University, there was an organization called the Student Homophile League, which Nino Romano helped create. And that really was my first introduction to gay community life. Then Arthur and I started to become interested in what else was available in the gay community. And we went to the Madison Society, and they were a nice group, but it kind of felt like we were in Sunday school, you know, and we wanted more than Sunday school, but we weren't quite sure what we wanted. And then we read an article in the New York Times that there had been a riot at this bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall, and it had gone on for several nights. And then there was an article in the Village Voice about it. So we decided to go down and explore the village a little bit. And I never forget one August night, we were walking down Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. It was a very foggy night. It was hard to see and kind of a little mysterious. And this very thin, willowy person, almost like a sprite, emerged from the fog and gave us a leaflet which said, "Come to this revolutionary group of fags called the Gay Liberation Front." And then he disappeared into the fog. So we went to the first meeting, and we were a little shy at first. We went outside and saying, "What's meeting inside here?" And Acid John, who was one of the early members of the Gay Liberation Front, said, "Oh, a bunch of spaced out faggots." He was one of them. So we thought, well, that's for us. So we went inside, and we joined the Gay Liberation Front. And it was an exhilarating experience because there were all these people who had a sense of gay pride. They saw being gay as something positive, something that contributed to your life, something that contributed to the culture. It was not a negative thing at all. It was something to build on and to celebrate and be happy about and wonderful about. And almost all of us had had experiences in other movements, such as the peace movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the student movement. I was involved in all of those, and so were many of the rest of us. So the feeling that we had was, well, all these other groups are standing up for their rights, and we just had a riot at Stonewall. Maybe we should stand up for our rights too, and in an organized way. So the Gay Liberation Front was a very wonderful experience for us. People today who walk down Castro Street or scenes in Manhattan or other cities take for granted an entire host of privileges that did not exist in the 1950s and 1940s and even in the 1960s. Just the right to walk down the street and feel like a positive person, the right to have civil rights, basic civil rights. All those things did not exist. And they came into existence because people who had been isolated individuals came together and formed a community. And the community insisted that those rights come into existence. So what the gay liberation movement did in the 70s leading up to the 80s was it created a community. It helped people gain a sense of self-respect, and it changed the political structure and introduced new idioms into artistic media. I think that's a pretty good accomplishment.
If you're visible in society, society can't ignore you. And the great struggle for gay people has always been, are you going to declare yourself? Are you going to come out? Are you going to be visible? Because the more of us there are, the less scared of us everybody else is, because they see that we're human beings. And I remember Jesse Jackson years ago saying, well, you can't compare this to the civil rights struggle because you can't not be black, and you can choose not to be gay. And I said to him, well, you know, you can choose to live a lie. That's the choice you make. But you can't choose not to be gay. When they say it's a matter of choice, the choice is, are you going to admit to it? Are you going to live it openly, or are you going to hide it? And in that regard, it has a lot more to do with the anti-defamation movement that the Jews, myself included, have been a part of for all these years, because lots of people who were Jewish would never reveal it, but it's still some people I know don't reveal it, and it's the only way to neuter the the opposition is to say, hey, when you say that, when you make that joke, you're talking about me, not some abstract creature. You're talking about me right here in front of you.
What is gay liberation? First of all, it's different than emancipation. With emancipation, we ask our oppressor to give us freedom, like the Emancipation Proclamation. With liberation, we claim our freedom. And you put the word gay in front of it, and it's gay people claiming their freedom. Gay liberation said we are a people who have a history of oppression, and that our liberation will open up a period of intense, alive growth for us. And we will move on to the next phase of our development, which is really self-definition of who we are. The word homosexual is a term laid on us by our oppressors. And unfortunately, we carry it around like a chain and ball around our ankle no matter where we go. And it's not who we really are. It's how our oppressors defined us. What I found in, let's say, 1969, when I started community organizing in Los Angeles, you found people who were lost, no sense of identity, being afraid, high degree of alcoholism and other self-destructive behavior, the sorts of things that one would expect from a people who have been oppressed. Frantz Fanon, the French psychiatrist who wrote The Wretched of the Earth, which had a profound effect on my generation during the revolution of the 60s, found the same kinds of phenomena among the Algerians who were under French colonial rule. Self-destructive behavior as they tried to survive in a structure that said that they were inferior. During the 60s, we do have the Black Civil Rights Movement. We have Black Panthers. We have the New Left. We have the Women's Liberation Movement, the second phase of feminism. We have social injustice movements taking place. We're ending a war in Vietnam, which we never should have gotten into to begin with. We were lied to. And our Secretary of Defense even apologized to the American people for misleading the American people. So that was the climate we were in. Young men were being drafted and sent off to Vietnam, many of them to never return again. So there was a necessity to take it to the streets, to fight back against this power structure in the only way that we could. There were rumbles leading up to it, but that was the match that lit the fire. And that's why it's important that at a certain moment, a window of opportunity opened up for us as gay people. And there were enough of us who went through that window of opportunity to make it a difference. Another way of saying it is critical mass theory. That it had been building, but at a certain point, the critical mass was developed, and gay people said, no more. We're going to fight back. We're not going to take this. Well, the initials, again, stand for Gay Liberation Front. Liberation movements around the world use that word front to designate them as a liberation movement. The people in Algeria fighting against the French, the North Vietnamese in Vietnam use the word front. What it means is like the front lines. These are people, front is a coalition of groups who come together to become the frontline organization fighting against whatever the oppressor is.
And by the end of the year, Gay Activist Alliance split off from the Gay Liberation Front because they were too Marxist and too theoretical and less action-oriented, and we wanted to reform the system. They wanted to wait for the revolution, and the people who left them to form GAA wanted to have a new society born from the society that is, not to simply kill it and replace it. Stonewall happened in June of 1969. GLF, Gay Liberation Front, and GAA, Gay Activist Alliance, formed in July and December of that year. I took a cab and went to the Gay Activist Alliance because it was advertised on the back page bulletin board of the Village Voice, and so began my career as a gay activist. GAA was meeting in this church hall for its first year, and we were collecting money, we were starting to hold dances in various places, and that brought in money. And soon we were looking for a more permanent headquarters. So we sent out scouts to look, and what they found was an abandoned firehouse on Worcester Street, I think number 99 if I'm not mistaken, in Soho. And we rented the place and dolled it up a little bit. It was several stories. The main story was where, and of course it had doors that slid open in the front for the fire trucks to come out. The main story is where we held our meetings and our dances. Then there was a spiral staircase going up to the second floor, and it was a great view from the spiral staircase to look down at the throng of people at a meeting or at a dance. And on the second floor we had the beginnings of a community center where people could come and have coffee and hang out, and some couches and so on. And then on the third floor we had offices, and we showed videotapes of our Zaps, hoping to politicize people. It was a vain attempt, you know. People came because they wanted to dance, but some people stayed and joined the movement. Our great years in Gay Activist Alliance were 1970, 71, 72. I became the vice president of the organization after being the secretary. And we left it, and its glory days didn't go on. The organization itself lasted some 13 years. There was a small group that continued to meet and to revere its former members and leaders. And it wasn't until somebody was using GAA stationery to state policy that the organization didn't believe in that they formally disbanded. I went to that last meeting and wrote an article about it called, they called it The Day Gay Lived Died, tacky title. But it was a really sad moment because GAA meant a great deal to me. The firehouse itself didn't last too long because it burned down a couple of years after we left. Everyone thinks the fire was suspicious, but I don't know that they ever arrested anybody for it. GAA meant so much that this ring, which is a lambda, which is the symbol of the Gay Activist Alliance, which means a reaction, a chemical reaction with total exchange of energy, no waste products. And that's why it was picked. And we popularized that actually around the country until it was later replaced by the pink triangle and by the rainbow flag. But it was our beginning. And this ring that I'm wearing was given to Jim Owls as the first president of GAA, and when he was dying, he asked me to wear it for him because I was his vice president, and I've kept it on ever since. We also spawned, if that's a good word, a lot of other groups. So gay lawyers, gay teachers, even gay police, and a lot of other organizations, doctors and so on, all organized on the basis of Gay Activist Alliance. Members from Gay Activist Alliance, went out and helped organize these other groups. There was a gay college professors group and a gay high school teachers group. That was one of its lasting legacies, I think. It made the movement go on into the present, actually.
And a friend of mine by the name of Marty Robinson and another friend by the name of Jim Owls said, why don't we form a new group that would be dedicated primarily and exclusively, actually, to gay issues, and that would be existential rather than ideological. That is, we wouldn't claim to have an analysis for everything in the world. What we would do was we would go out and encounter the world, and our analysis would emerge from encountering the world. It was a very existential, kind of postmodern, actually, although that word didn't exist then. And the architect for creating that dialogue with the world was Marty Robinson, who was the smartest person I've ever known in my life. Not the most learned, and not always the most pleasant, but definitely the smartest. The Gay Activists Alliance was originally a political organization. We aimed at reforming the laws by confronting oppressors. There were other people in GAA, especially Vito Russo, who said, what about the cultural revolution? What about the arts? What about creating new forms of dialogue? What about reclaiming movies? And I was skeptical at first to this. I thought, these guys are just diverting us from our political goals. I'm sorry, I can't get behind this. But we had a committee in GAA called the Pleasure Committee. And the purpose of the Pleasure Committee was to counterbalance all the politics and ideology. I think every organization should have a Pleasure Committee, don't you? So they did. And they kept pushing and pushing and saying, politics is not enough. We have to have a cultural revolution. And in fact, GAA, Gay Activists Alliance, redefined itself. And there's a whole aspect of gay history having to do with a cultural revolution that the Gay Activists Alliance created that has mostly gone unnoticed. Most people hear of GAA and they think politics. But in fact, it was politics and culture.
Today, one of the two big fights is over marriage. And in 1970, whatever, we talked about such things, and we were more likely to be talking about how we did not want to imitate the oppression of marriage in the gay community, which we saw as being very oppressive, particularly to women, and did not want to follow suit. That's changed, obviously, and it's changed for good reasons, but it's not. It's more complicated than simply that. On the other hand, when the city clerk at the time made a denigrating remark about gays relative to marriage, we were within a week or so at the marriage bureau with passing out wedding cake and taking over the office. So, you know, the other big issue, of course, today being the military, which at that time it was an outside issue, so there was no official position on this. But the reality is that most of us were going to the peace marches, you know, the anti-Vietnam, anti-war marches, and we're not interested at all in, as we would have phrased it then, the right to be equal oppressors.
The gay press was one of the first things that sprang up after Stonewall. Actually, there had already been some small, very limited publications before that, but the idea of a public newspaper that went on sale on the newsstands and said gay in the masthead, that didn't happen until right after Stonewall. But the gay press was probably the biggest force in shaping a sense that there was a gay community, because you could read about people like you even if you didn't know any of them. Gay community news went to, I think 1/4 of the circulation went to places outside major cities. So the isolation that so many gay people had felt for so long, this idea of, well, I'm the only one, there's nobody else around, I must be some sort of oddball, the press overcame that. The early gay press did not simply report on the gay community, it created the gay community, a kind of community that was in touch with one another and could support people to go out and do the kind of reporting, either political or historical or cultural, that wasn't going to be done anywhere else.
ZAP was a movement, an action by the Gay Activists Alliance. We were a non-violent group by charter, and when we did a ZAP, we would do a protest demonstration as theatrical as we could make it. So when we discovered that an organization called Fidelifacts was selling information about gay people to prospective employers and costing people their jobs, and because their owner said, you know, when asked, how do you know it's a gay person, he said, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. So Marty Robinson, a friend of ours, who was one of the other founders, by the way, of Gay Activists Alliance, and Tom Dorr, his lover, Marty got dressed up in a duck costume, and the rest of us had a picket line, you know, in front of the building. If I used my imagination, I can say we went upstairs and trashed their files, but that never happened.
Zaps were an art form, kind of like an installation. That word is used in the arts. It's kind of like an installation, except it was participatory, and it aimed to bridge the gap between the political and the personal. We faced all these institutions, the church, the state, labor unions, political parties, psychiatric organizations. They all didn't want to have anything to do with us. We were absolutely taboo to them. And Marty said, they hide behind their institutional facades. They don't experience the personal consequences of what they're doing. We're going to make all this personal. And the Zap was a form of nonviolent, person-to-person, very loud, very vocal confrontation, but it was also very funny, very theatrical, and eloquent. It wasn't just making a lot of noise. It was making a lot of noise that entertained people. We wanted to entertain people. We wanted this to be a good show. But it also had a point, a very heavy point to it. If enough people saw these Zaps on television, we always took the media off ahead of time, where we were confronting politicians and other people. If gay people in the closet saw that on television, they would be so thrilled by the theatricality of it that they would be drawn in even if they didn't agree with the politics of it. And that's in fact what happened. Hundreds of people came in who just said, wow, this is just so exciting. What does it mean? Well, we said, come on a Zap and we'll show you what it means. We adopted a motto, a Zap a day keeps the shrink away. And the reason for that was because a lot of gay people were depressed because the situation was depressing. And rather than take drugs or try to change yourself, let's go out and confront the system and make a better world. That's the way to deal with depression. We have been trying to get the liberal Republican mayor, John Lindsay of New York, to support a simple gay rights bill that would outlaw job discrimination and housing discrimination. And we called upon him to stop raids on gay bars, such as the Snake Pit and Stonewall. And he would not meet with us. He just brushed us aside. His attitude was, I have more important things to talk about. So we decided to confront him personally over the political implications of his life, and that's what a Zap is. As it turns out, early in 1970, the Metropolitan Museum of New York celebrated its 100th anniversary. And the museum announced that the first 50 people in line would get to shake hands with Mayor Lindsay and also get a plaque, a souvenir plaque. We in GAA found out about this ahead of time through one of our spies in the system. And we were the first 50 people in line. So after the mayor spoke briefly, Marty Robinson went up and shook his hand and would not let go. And all the cameras are running. And Marty said, Mr. Mayor, when are you going to support civil rights for gay people? And Lindsay was totally nonplussed. He didn't know what to do. And he had to work a bit to get his hand back. Marty was not violent, but the mayor had to work to get his hand back. And the media were all there because this had been advertised ahead of time. So we made our point with Mayor Lindsay, and we also, since we were the first 50 people in line, got our little souvenir plaque. And this is it. It's a rainbow. Isn't that sweet? It's kind of prophetic. And the background says, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1870 to 1970. So this was our first big rainbow Zap. There was an editor at Harper's, Midge Dexter, who liked to pose as this really hip, urban, sophisticated person. And she had an author publish an article in that. I believe it was, his last name was Epstein. And Harper's was a sophisticated urban journal. And in this article, Epstein said, I wish homosexuality is a curse that should be wished off the face of the earth. And we thought that that was outrageous for a professional magazine that appealed to sophisticated New Yorkers, especially, to publish. So we decided, once again, to have a Zap. And Arthur Bell was involved in this Zap, as were other people. And it was kind of a soft Zap. We didn't want to be too heavy-handed because we do support freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but we also wanted to make a point. So we went in with coffee and donuts once again, and we handed them out to the people who worked in the office, and we tried to explain to them why they were being so totally Neanderthal in New York City. Please, give me a break. And Mitch Dexter was sitting right next to me, smoking a cigarette, blowing the smoke in my face and justifying what she did. And I couldn't restrain myself anymore. She was making all these excuses. And I said to her in the top of my voice as loud as I could, "Damn you, Midge Dexter. You have failed in your responsibility as an editor. You know you should have never published this article." And she grew very quiet, and that was the end of the Zap.
Gay liberation was based on women's liberation. That if not for the women freeing themselves and becoming seen as equal, gays never could have made that step themselves, because we were seen as a kind of tail to that dog, if you wish. It was because the subject of sexuality was part and parcel of women's liberation. It was because lesbians were part and parcel of women's liberation, much as people like Betty Friedan did not like to know about that. And gays learned from women. It's not that gays were all effeminate, because we're not. Some are, some aren't, that's fine. But it was because the politics of the 20th century had moved from the suffragette movement to the black civil rights movement. I'm probably skipping some other movements. The American Indian movement was eventually in there too. But feminism, women's liberation, was based on black liberation. And hence gay liberation was based in its turn on feminine liberation, because it was an offshoot of it. In those years, there was a lot of mistrust of men, both from the feminist world, who saw men as their oppressors, and from the lesbian world, which had to work in organizations with men, and eventually split off and formed their own groups. They had their own group, Daughters of Bilitis, but they formed Lesbian Feminist Liberation by leaving Gay Activist Alliance. Also, a group left the Gay Liberation Front, which preceded the Gay Activist Alliance. So there was a good deal of discomfort, let's say, if not outright hostility, between men and women.
The sensibilities were very, very different. You have to remember in the 70s, there were a lot of fights between gay men and lesbians over not just sensibility, but politics. In San Francisco, a lot of them were over public sex. In New York, a lot of them were over race. And these tribes that now are much more unified, came out of very, very different places.
I think that the attitude varied quite a lot. There were gay men who really supported lesbians, and some who just tolerated lesbians, and some who were openly hostile to lesbians. I mean, to give you an example of the insensitivity, was at the first, or one of the first GAU conferences, I was a last-minute stand-in on some panels. Somebody had gotten sick, and there I was, and I was on a panel with Frank Kameny. And he was from Mattachine, so he was from an earlier generation even. And he said in response to a woman in the audience who asked about lesbians with children, he said, "Well, if you were really a lesbian, you wouldn't have children." And actually, he ultimately did us a favor, because a group called Dykes with Tykes emerged from that meeting because of his insensitive remark. So I think there was a kind of lack of understanding generally. So at some point, a lot of the lesbians withdrew from the GLF and formed a separate group called the Lavender Menace.
In the 70s, the gay rights movement was still, defined by sexism. It was a gay male movement for the most part. Jean O'Leary was an ex-nun who was very involved in the Firehouse and the Gay Activist Alliance. At one point, she led a walkout of the women from the Firehouse. She led a walkout of the women, and for several years, she ran Lesbian Feminist Liberation, which was a separatist movement. So during that period, at least on the East Coast, there was the gay rights movement, which was all male, and then Lesbian Feminist Liberation movement, which was female. Some say it was when the Gay Activist Alliance passed a resolution requiring the Lesbian Affairs Subcommittee that could not have an official meeting unless there was a man present, which was the sort of official issue. But Jean always claimed that the straw that broke the camel's back was over making of the coffee. And it was just, that had been an ongoing thing. It was just at one meeting, Jean was not going to let the women make the coffee anymore. And she stood up and dramatically and marched out and took all the women out. So we had this separatist movement for some time. And then a compromise was brokered with Bruce Veller, who was the executive director of the National Gay Task Force, that Jean would come in as co-executive director of the National Gay Task Force. From that moment, the principle of co-gendered leadership, I think, was accepted.
Sylvia Rivera was another big name in the street transvestites movement. They called their group STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. And they confronted Gay Activist Alliance, just as we confronted the psychologists and other groups. We were the liberals that they confronted because no one else was about to listen to them. And so it created issues such as when we went to City Hall to have hearings about our gay rights bill, which took about 15 years to pass, and we went back every year and tried. Some men dressed as women tried to go into the women's bathroom or into the men's bathroom, and everybody got into a consternation about which bathroom they belonged in and why, and this was like old thinking to us. Our bathrooms were unisex in our clubhouse. In GAA, I think there was, for some people, a grudging respect for drag queens, but seeing them as a problem because if we embraced their cause as well as our cause, I personally saw it all as one cause, but if we embraced the cause of drag, that might inhibit the success of the gay liberation movement. And so some people wanted the drag people to wait a little longer. My feeling was, let's have the whole package at once, because it's really totally inseparable. But I know that means it takes longer, and it did take longer. And still drag queens are not fully accepted, but gender expression is now a protected class in a lot of places. We were a movement in some degree of conflict. The women were already, getting ready to leave. The drag queens were unhappy with the women. The leather people felt, ignored. Everybody was up in the air.
Back then, the lesbians hated men. The drag queens hated lesbians. The drag queens were not comfortable around men. They were only comfortable around, everybody was in a group and they all were kind of at war with each other.
In GLF, there were two very prominent drag queens, as they would have called themselves back then. We did not use the word transgender. Sylvia Rivera and Marcia P. Johnson, the P standing for Pay It No Mind. And they were both extremely feisty transgendered people, or street transvestites, as they would have called themselves. Sylvia, interestingly enough, I remember her mostly wearing slacks, and she was not kind of what people would think of as a drag queen walking around in finery, a kind of fancy ball gown. I would say walking into GLF in my first meetings, I was a little bit offended by them. I had been in Red Stockings before the GLF, and the feminist line was that a lot of the transvestites made fun of women by copying the most feminine women. In those days, they were likely to dress as Judy Garland, or Karen Black was kind of popular, and Barbra Streisand was extremely popular, whereas we felt that they didn't look like the average woman on the street. And the other thing that feminists would have said is you shouldn't change the bird to fit the cage. That you really need to change society and not change how you look. However, in GLF, I got to know these two individuals well. I worked on the dances and helped close up the dances and sweep the floors and clean up all the garbage. And afterwards, I would go out with Sylvia and Marcia to after-hours clubs, which opened at around 3 a.m. The dances closed about 2 or 3, so we would get out and go to a club around 4 o'clock in the morning. and they were great fun. So they really changed my mind about who they were once I got to know them as individuals.
The Baz was paradise on earth. Of course, it was all sex objectification and anonymous sex and promiscuity and all those terrible things that were so much fun. And that was a place where you could dance, you could eat, you could swim, you could take steam, you could go prowling around the rooms and find someone to have sex with. It was a nice little weekend respite for me. Fire Island was a haven for gay people, at least in two towns, Cherry Grove and the Pines. However, that's all on the surface because the people from both towns met in the middle in the sand dunes and had sex at night. So all the social things fell away. We had magical times on the island. People used to dress as they wished, and I let myself free. We could wear fewer clothes, we could wear weirder clothes, we could be whoever we wanted to be. There were stories about the police coming from the mainland of Long Island to raid the gays, but it didn't happen while I was there. And there were big, fabulous parties, you know, with themes such as a color theme, the white party, and various social themes they would come up with. And curiously, even though Fire Island was the gay world, such as we had it, people there were still very close-mouthed about it. They would go into the woods and have sex. They would make sly innuendos when talking to other people. They would act as Nelly or feminine as they wanted to, but people didn't like it openly said that they were gay. So the houses had all these charming names that, you know, you could easily understand once you know who they are. For example, a house called Wounded Knees, a house called White Swallows, a purple house called Catherine the Grape, a leather house called Cries and Whimpers. People were very imaginative in their homes. And we called our house Gay and Proud. And this caused a lot of consternation in the neighborhood because people weren't used to that sort of thing. We painted it on a piece of driftwood and we put it right out in front of our house. And we were making people confront the fact of who they were and say it, because that's what we truly believed in, that if you can name yourself and find dignity and pride in yourself, you are a freer person. We took the whole dance and shut it down at 2 a.m., much to the neighbors' delight, because they were always calling the police on us. We took them over to City Councilman Saul Sharrison's house, which was on 11th Street, and made a lot of noise in front of his house because he was the chairman of a committee where our civil rights bill was bottled up. He wouldn't have hearings on it, and he wouldn't let it out of his committee. So, you know, he was like the stumbling block for us. So we aroused all his neighbors to tell them what a rotten person they had for a neighbor. A few of our people were led around the corner by policemen and bashed a little bit. But the ultimate upshot was, after this and a demonstration at City Hall as well, where I was arrested, he did finally let the bill out of committee. And it was, of course, voted down. And we went year after year. Other people went in the latter years. I didn't go for 15 years. I remember one time I was learning how to crochet. I was crocheting this embarrassing scarf. And naturally I brought it with me, feeling like Madame Defarge in Tale of Two Cities. And my brother saw us on television and said, "It's bad enough you have to be on TV about that stuff, but do you have to knit?" The gay rights law took about 15 or 16 years to actually pass from the time that we originally drafted it. Jim Alls and I went down to meet Councilman Eldon Klingon with the first draft of the bill, and he decided to support us. But it was voted down by the city council or its committees time after time after time. We would go in the first years and throw over the chairs in disgust and go out and stop traffic in the streets and so on. But eventually it got passed, even though our day was over. What it was an effort to prevent gays from being fired for being gay, including in teaching positions, which were pretty sensitive, and to prevent gays from being evicted from their apartments for being gay. Of course, landlords always had the out. I need it for my daughter-in-law, and employers always had the out. You know, there's somebody else who needs this job, or he's not working out, or she's not working out. But it became a law that could be appealed to. If people thought that somebody was getting around that law, they had a place to go now. And I think it's made it a lot. No, people don't think about firing queer teachers in the way that they used to.
It was pretty astonishing that a place like New York City wouldn't have a gay rights bill. So that was the topic of a lot of conversation at Poker. And there were hearings. They would happen about once a year. It was always the same dance of death. It was the General Welfare Committee. This is back when the city council had virtually no power, except for things like passing the gay rights bill, which they refused to do year after year. And the busloads of opposition would come in, the Roman Catholics and the Hasidic Jews, and it was just a circus of hatred, to be honest, where these religious figures would get up and just denounce the entire gay community of New York. And that committee was run by a woman named Eileen Ryan from Staten Island. And of course, this council speaker, Tom Cute, would never let she wouldn't let it out of committee, and even if she did, he would never let it, pass. It was abominable. This bill, I didn't know at the time, had been introduced way back in 1971, and I knew it was called Intro 1. I guess it was primordial. It was one of the first bills, ever introduced in that committee or something. And Mayor Koch, who some people say is homosexual, I have no proof of that, did nothing to help the bill. He paid lip service to it. But Mayor Koch, Greenwich Village, back then when Democrats just ruled the world, it seemed, especially in New York, the only thing to do was to fight with each other. So you had the sort of traditional village Democrats who were liberal, and then you had the progressive West Village Democrats who were super liberal, and they hated each other. They just fought like banshees. Well, Koch was liberal, not super liberal. And we were all, of course, over on the super liberal side. So we hated Koch because he didn't, but he didn't do enough to pass the bill. He could have gotten it passed. He didn't get it passed. He didn't push the people in the council that he needed to. And he, succumbed to pressure from, again, the Catholic Church just also had an enormous political power in the city. I just, again, remember every year going to that hearing and then going to the voting committee and just knowing what the outcome was going to be. And then things started changing, and I believe some new people got on the council and got on that committee, and it wasn't until 1986, but I'll never forget it, I was preparing to move. I was going to move away and live in Mexico City for a few years, and it got passed out of committee, and the city council approved it. And we had a gay rights bill, and I'll never forget, I believe it was in June, it was in the spring, and everybody ran down to City Hall, and there was a official celebration in the rotunda. And then, of course, that day Congress voted against money for the Contras in Nicaragua. So the next day, the big headline across the front page was, Contras no, gays yes.
I came out to all of my classes from 1970 on, and I taught for 43 years. And as the years went by, I could see a change. At first, it was very shocking for my students to hear a teacher discussing this stuff. But because of the movement and because of the organization of GAA, I felt I had support behind me, and I wanted to teach this. I wanted people to know it. I taught a course in homosexuals and literature in 1973, which had a very small attendance. And people didn't want to put it on their transcripts. Later on, I taught a course called Gay Male Literature first gay literature and then gay male literature. And there was a separate course for lesbian literature. So things changed. My students at first were shocked by it. I would get statements written by them saying, I can't view you as my professor any longer, only as a homosexual. You know, they just couldn't open their minds. But later it became such a casual thing. I used to do it the first day of class because I was angry. And then I relaxed and let it happen organically sometime in the semester. If somebody wrote a paper about it or if the subject came up, I would say, oh, I am too. Sometimes I would get angry at a student who wrote a very well-written paper saying, never for 1 minute will I stand these homosexuals. If one comes on to me, I will punch him in the face. And I gave him an A for his good writing, and I wrote, fuck you on the top of the paper. In later years, the students and the society took it much more casually. In fact, people kept asking me, why do you bother to tell us? I mean, what's so important? And in my school, of course, everybody knew anyway. I mean, I was hardly a secret on campus. But I came out to the president of the college. I did what I could.
In the late 70s, when I went to New York, the so-called gay scene at Studio 54 was a lot of famous gay people with their beards. And there were still people who were taking dates of the opposite sex to public functions. I remember coming to Esquire magazine, and when I was, Clay Felker, the editor, brought me out there for a couple of weeks, and I had this kind of Cinderella trip around New York. And someone said to me at the time, oh, well, we know Andy Tobias. Well, what I knew and that they didn't know was that Andy Tobias was not out of the closet at the time. He had written a famous gay novel, but he'd written it under a pseudonym, and he didn't come out of the closet for another 20 years. There were very few people in the New York scene because it was so driven by success, by ambition. Very few people who would take the risk of being out of the closet or what they perceived as the risk. In 1981, about the time that well, when the Celluloid Closet came out, I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times. And I quoted Vito in the piece because he was the one who had told me that Judy Garland's funeral had been one of the things that had lit the fires of Stonewall. And I referred to him in the piece as gay film historian Vito Russo. And I got this panicked phone call from an editor at the New York Times saying, we can't say this. And I said, you can't say what? He says, we can't call this man gay. And I said, this man is very famous. He's out of the closet. He's a gay activist. He said, I'm sorry, it's too much of a risk for the New York Times. We have to have an affidavit. It was so much fun to call Vito up and tell him about this. I said, I'm sorry, you have to go out somewhere and get an affidavit saying that you're queer. He was delighted, of course, and I don't know whether he went to a lawyer or a notary public, but the New York Times got their affidavit saying that Vito Russo was, in fact, gay. And I'm very proud of the fact that that particular op-ed piece was the first time that the New York Times actually used the word gay on their editorial page, because up to that point, they would always say homosexual. In 1981, when the Gay Men's Chorus went on tour around the States, the very year that The Celluloid Closet was published, I tried to get some national publicity outlets to cover the fact that a group of gay men were getting on a bus and going to Nebraska and singing Stout-Hearted Men in school auditoriums. I thought that was kind of worthy of news. They wouldn't touch it because they were still working on keeping us silent, keeping us out of the picture. They didn't want anybody to see what we were doing.
In the late 70s, there was a lot of partying. There was disco, there was drugs, and then there was complacency because a certain degree of acceptance had been achieved. And I think also you have to understand that the goals of gay people at the time were not quite what they are today. Nobody wanted to get married. Nobody wanted to have children, and nobody wanted to serve in the military. That was something that squares did. I mean, straight people didn't want any of those three things either, and they ran away from them. So at the time, we had pretty much what we were looking for, and that's why the gay liberation movement had gotten kind of stale and quiet, and what kicked it into high gear was the advent of AIDS. Ronald Reagan was a Republican. I mean, With Carter, there had been gay people in the White House. Midge Costanza was a liaison to the gay community, appointed by Jimmy Carter. You know, whenever the Democrats are in control, things are better for us generally. And now it was the Republicans, and a right-wing Republican to boot, and a guy who wouldn't even say the word. You know, for the longest time, he just wouldn't even say it. And with the first lady whose hairdresser was a screaming queen, but she wouldn't say the word either. Nobody would admit anything. And of course, there were a lot of closeted gays in Reagan's administration that were noisily arrested for one thing or another. So it was interesting to watch all that.
I came out like in 1975. And so for that time between Stonewall and the epidemic was a period of sort of hypersexuality that you know, I don't know, will maybe a long time before we ever see anything about it. And it brought challenges and problems, but it also created something that is very powerful, very beautiful, very meaningful to a lot of gay men. I don't think there was ever a sense that we were done, but there was a sense, even if people didn't articulate it, that it was a very different era. You know, preppy style was coming in. It was a very conservative club. Ronald Reagan was the new president. You know, we had turned a corner from one time in the country to another. And in fact, a story that I think is relevant to that, when Steve Endine, who was head of Gay Rights National Lobby, in 1976, there was a Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Vallejo that facilitated the development, the phenomenon of PACs, of political action committees. And every interest group was forming PACs at this time. And Steve thought that we needed a PAC for gay issues. And so he was going to start a political action committee as part of Gay Rights National Lobby. And he was proposing to call it the Human Rights Campaign Fund. And the idea was that human rights was something people weren't quite as afraid of. You know, if you called it something gay, no one would ever give it money, and candidates would never accept it. You know, and Alan Barron was a direct mail and sort of wizard and political genius who was helping Steve with that, and I was helping Alan on the project. And we're writing a fundraising letter and trying to find someone to sign it that would be prominent and would help raise money for this new gay PAC. And I remember Alan trying to convince Steve not to call it the Human Rights Campaign Fund, because we just elected Ronald Reagan, and Alan said human rights is a liberal Jimmy Carter era concept. Jimmy Carter talked a lot about human rights, and at the time his presidency was seen to be so failed that Alan argued we're entering a much more conservative era, and that gay rights needed to be packaged not in a human rights context, which is a liberal context, but in a conservative context. And he argued for calling the PAC something around privacy, which was a conservative concept. That first fundraising letter that we did, that I got Tennessee Williams to sign, was to raise money for the Privacy Project 82, a project of the Human Rights Campaign Fund. And sometimes I wonder, and I can't predict whether it would have been better or not, but you know, what if the Human Rights Campaign, which today is so massive and so large, in part because they started so early with mass-marketed fundraising techniques, what if instead they had focused on marketing privacy rather than human rights? Because you have to remember, at this time, there was already a gay Republican group. There was a gay Republican group, Concerned Americans for Individual Rights, that started during the Ford administration. So gay rights weren't a partisan issue at that time. That's, I think, another thing that people forget. Like in Washington socially, you'd have, you know, real extreme right-wingers and left-wingers all closeted at the same party and respecting each other's closets. You know, that was never really a consideration. That operated, the gay world operated totally separate from the realities of partisan politics. And the election of Reagan is when that really started to change. There were always the people who were within that realm or potentially within that realm, and then the rest of the gay community that didn't pay attention, that didn't care, at their own peril. You know, and I was someone who, you know, came from a very political background, and it was very natural for me to sort of feel the politics around that. From the beginning, there was always a sense, those of us who care, those of us who have this commitment that is, you know, we didn't talk about it in these terms, but it was, you know, like a lifetime commitment. This is what our lives were about. were somewhat apart from, most of the gay people out there who were just dealing with coming out or dealing with, their substance abuse or psychotherapy issues or their family issues or whatever, and weren't politicized in the way some of us were. I always say that I identified as that I knew I was a feminist long before I knew I was gay. So what makes some people just sort of feel this compulsion to, participate and facilitate change and to, correct the errors we see around us, to feel like we are contributing something to creating a better society? I recognize that not everybody feels that. I don't understand why someone can't feel that or doesn't feel that, because it just, if you have your eyes open and you're listening and you see what's around you, how can someone live in this world without devoting what you can to make the world a better place? I mean, it's like so simple and cliche, but and why some people see that and others don't, I can't answer. I don't know. This wasn't long after the Anita Bryant campaign, so it was right at the beginning of feeling this intense backlash. It was more, it was when Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, was just, gaining speed. So I think it was a moment where the post-Stonewall years, where things grew so rapidly and so the sort of establishment of this, more visible out community and the political organizations, then NGTF, National Gay Task Force, was founded, Lambda was founded, these sort of beginning organizations. But the enemy was not as sort of generalized societal as it had always been. It was becoming much more specific. It was Anita Bryant. It was Jerry Falwell. It was these sort of emerging organizations and individuals who were really seeking to capitalize on fear and ignorance about homosexuality. I think it was NYPAC, which was the first gay political action committee in New York. They used to have meetings at the Salmagundi Club. It was before there was a gay community center in New York. So it was, much more of a network. We didn't have facilities. We didn't have much more of the activism was actually in the bars. When there was, a spontaneous demonstration in the street, people would go into the bars with flyers and pass them out. You can't even imagine that hardly today. You get kicked out. In some ways, I think the emergence of the threats like Anita Bryant in Dade County and other campaigns to repeal the first non-discrimination ordinances that were passed and the Briggs Initiative in California, are mobilizing to oppose these very specific threats actually did sort of start the foundation for the first responses around the epidemic. It was a lot of the same people were involved. Of course, very quickly after the epidemic hit, it just turned to a whole different kind of fear and activism.
If you lived through the beginnings of AIDS, you remember something entirely different than what exists today. You remember a time when people were in abject panic, when they were watching living ghosts walking down the street, and they didn't know how they got this disease or how they could keep from getting the disease, when people were being shunned from their jobs, thrown out by their families. It was a shocking, horrifying, traumatic time. And the heroes that arose from that time were the ones who stood proudly and said, "This is who I am." Bobby Campbell here called himself the poster boy for AIDS. I think the early media reports of AIDS were in part responsible for the panic because of the way in which it was all presented. We can't really blame them for not knowing what we ourselves did not know at that point. And there were some efforts to show people with AIDS, to humanize them and to create sympathy for them. I feel okay about that aspect of it. What really annoyed me was what emerged not too long after the epidemic became nationally known, was the notion that, well, finally something has come along to make these fags grow up. Well, those of us who had been coming out to our families in the 70s and making families of our own had already grown up. We didn't need AIDS. We certainly didn't need it in San Francisco, where 3 years before we'd had our supervisor and our mayor murdered in a homophobic act. We were already grown up. We already had families, and those families were in place when we started dying. And I think it was also the moment in which lesbians very selflessly offered their support to gay men in a way that hadn't happened the other way around previous to that. Rock Hudson's AIDS diagnosis was basically the watershed from which we can date a number of things. Certainly the public sophistication about AIDS, a human face, ironically a movie star, is the first human being they recognized when we'd seen thousands of human beings die by that time. But a movie star was what it took for the public and the press to sit up and take notice of the disease. Randy Schiltz, the guy that wrote And the Band Played On, was a friend of mine, and he called me up when Rock Hudson's AIDS diagnosis was announced and asked me if I would talk about the fact that Rock was gay, because he knew that I knew Rock. And I knew that it was what I had to do. I knew that someone was going to have to step forward and discuss this in a civilized manner to say that Rock was loved, and that that Hollywood knew that he was gay. This was not some dark secret, however it's being portrayed. People have known for years that Rock Hudson is gay, and this is really about Hollywood's response to the closet. I was one of two people that would actually talk about it to People magazine. I think the other one was Mamie Van Doren, and God bless her. And but I'm very proud of having done it, although I took a lot of shit at the time, especially from gay people right here in the Castro, because it gave the press a template from which to work. People magazine wrote basically their first civilized profile on a gay celebrity when they covered Rock Hudson. And they could do it without being fueled by tabloid rumors, because somebody stepped forward and said, yes, I'll talk about it, I'm not ashamed, and I think I owe it to him to say what a good guy he was.
The first signs were only a few people, 12 people, had this mysterious skin cancer, and we didn't know it was a big deal. I was already with Larry by this time. It was 1982 when we got together, and he said, this is going to be a big deal. This is going to change everybody's life.
AIDS has had a big impact on my life. I'm HIV negative, but I've known, I would say, 100 people or so who have friends and acquaintances who have died from AIDS, and I've been arrested in ACT UP demonstrations and helped take care of people who died from AIDS. I first became aware that something was wrong in the spring of 1981, where a news report indicated that a new disease had appeared among a number of gay men on the East Coast. The cause was unknown. It often led to death within 6 months, and the disease, the number of people who had the disease, was doubling every 6 months. Well, I sat down with my little calculator, and it didn't take long to realize that if you double a number every 6 months, in a few years, you're going to have millions of people affected. I published an article in a local paper, San Francisco Bay Times, then called Coming Up, and it was reprinted in a New York paper. And basically I said, I go to the Bears, I see what's going on at the Bears, I look at these statistics, I think a great wave of death is going to pass over American gay men. There were people at the time who were outraged that I said that. I had people who stopped talking to me. There were people who said I was homophobic to say that. But I regret to say that that in fact is what happened. But the positive part of it was that our community responded to it. We were able to face up to the crisis. We confronted the government and the business establishment to change their ways. We changed our own behavior. We took care of people who died. We learned about health, and we became more responsive and loving, I think, in our personal relationships. And even though that was a terrible, terrible cost, and the cost is still continuing, I think we were able to turn it around because of the strength of community. Community has contained AIDS, and I think community will defeat it.
And there was a sense that homophobia was just taking off like wildfire because of AIDS. And there was a lot of talk, Christian talk, that, this was gays were reaping what they had sown, and, this was God striking down homosexuals for their immoral behavior, and people really becoming very homophobic. You see, this is what sin leads to. It was a freakish time. I remember flying in some kind of upgrade in first class at that time and getting into an argument with the man seated next to me who believed in tattoos and thought that people with AIDS should be tattooed. Long conversation with him about, the Holocaust and the implications of tattooing and concentration camp IDs, and then saying, what if your daughter misjudges someone she sleeps with and ends up with it? Do you want her to be tattooed? And at the end of this first class flight, he had changed his mind and decided he didn't believe it. And I was all, yes, I changed the mind of a Republican homophobe. But there were extremely homophobic responses to AIDS. After a few years, AIDS began to soften homophobia instead of make it worse. Because people's sons began to die, people's hairdressers began to die, people's work colleagues began to die. All of a sudden, it didn't matter whether you were out of the closet or not. If you died of AIDS, even if you were Rock Hudson, it had an impact. And the Rock Hudson death, I think, was really the big benchmark for that. And so all of a sudden, this world that had been shadowy, or only in New York and San Francisco, began to be a world with a face, and they were the faces of martyrs. And things switched. And I think by the late 80s, things had really switched enormously. And the New York Times played a big role at first in the homophobia, and then in the change when it finally began to recognize partners or companions in the obituaries. That again was a very significant date. There were so many more resources. There were so many more foundations, gay men who had left money for support for AIDS research, for support for people living with AIDS, that by the end of the 80s, there was beginning to be more concern about what AIDS was doing to communities that weren't gay, what it was doing to drug users, what it was doing to people of color, what it was doing to African American women, what it was doing to all these other communities that hadn't experienced that evolution of tolerance and that kind of financing. And that's, I think, when you begin to see AIDS organizations themselves changing and taking on a broader social role.
What I think got a lot of people active was the realization, once you found out what it was and what was happening and what the government wasn't doing, and that in fact the Reagan administration wouldn't even say the word AIDS, people got angry. And once you were angry, you began organizing and began getting active. I know that what I wound up doing was, because there was no money allocated to AIDS services or AIDS research, we started organizations to raise money for those purposes. And one way to raise a lot of money fast is to have a show. And it was real Mickey and Judy, but we would put on these benefits. And at the beginning, nobody wanted to do them because it was a scary disease and nobody wanted to be identified with it. And so there were very few people who would actually do these things. Joan Rivers was one of the first, and I think it was because her hairdresser got sick, and she's smart. And Nell Carter, whose brother got sick, she was one of the first. And Bet, who was surrounded by people who were getting sick, started doing these fundraising shows. And I joke that I got people to do these things because I would say, if you appear at my benefit, I will write your benefit. So that was how I got to work on all the bigger diseases. I would trade them off. I'd say, please come and do this AIDS thing, and I'll do cystic fibrosis. And so, okay, so I wound up doing everything. I mean, I became the expert on myasthenia gravis and, elephant man disease, and you just name it, I did a benefit for it, because it was a way to get people to come and do AIDS benefits. And until the government began slowly stepping up to the plate. And what did happen, I have to say, what happened was Elizabeth Taylor got involved with Rock Hudson. Elizabeth Taylor stepped in. And the amazing thing about Elizabeth is everybody will take her call. Even the Pope. I mean, if only to discuss jewelry. everybody listens to Elizabeth. And so when Elizabeth started calling people, things started happening. And she is really responsible for the AIDS movement. That was what actually galvanized the movement. And AIDS created the political movement that exists today. The infrastructure was created by the AIDS epidemic. People actually started organizations that moved things forward.
I remember going to the Gay Pride Parade in San Francisco in 1982, and everybody was talking about GRID, or some people were. It was probably one of the first times I had heard about it. And I remember the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence were speaking, and they were saying how you have to come out to your doctor, how important it was to tell your doctor you were gay because it was a health risk factor suddenly. And I think it was Sister Miracle Whip said, it's just like telling mom. Gay cancer, I think we were calling it. You certainly had heard about Kaposi sarcoma. I think I first heard that term at the Ninth Circle, sitting around smoking pot, wanting to be happy 22-year-old kid in the big city, listening to friends of friends who had these sores on their arms and stuff. You know, that was extremely scary. And I will never, ever forget, it must have been December of '82. We were in the Village, and we were at Alan Roscoff's house, and it was me and Vito and Jim and Arnie and Alan. We went downstairs and jumped in a cab to go out to dinner, and the subject of GRID came up. And kind of out of the blue, Vito kind of grabbed me and looked at me and said, you know, you have to wear condoms. You know that, right? And I didn't know that. I had no idea. And it obviously, you know, it impressed me. You know, that was the one and only safe sex education PSA I ever needed to hear.
I first heard about GRID on Fire Island in the last weeks of the summer of 1980. I was living in California. Enno Porsche's lover died. And Enno Porsche lived right across from me at Fire Island Pines. And his lover, they said he had cat scratch fever. And he was buried with the cat in a Hawaiian shirt. I remember it was at that funeral. Larry Kramer was sitting on the boardwalk of Fire Island Pines with a folded table. And he was talking about this gay cancer, which at the time was called gay reactive immunosuppressive disease, GRID. And there was something about Larry and the way he was carrying on about this that I just knew that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark, and I wrote him a check for $100. And then I went home to California, and that summer 3 guys got these spots on their chest and arms, which was called Kaposi sarcoma, which was a disease of older Jewish men whose immune systems were suppressed. The fall of 1980 and the spring of 1981 were sheer horror because nobody knew what it was. You didn't know whether it came from poppers. You didn't know whether it came from the bathroom. People were hysterical, okay? You didn't know how it was transmitted. I now, in 2009, have 2,225 friends that died of AIDS. I keep a list. I call it the dead list. My mother almost fainted when she saw it. And if I didn't have that list, I wouldn't remember some of these people. And that's why I keep the list, because I want to hold their memory sacrosanct to me. And I classify them as friends if I either had a meal with them or I went to the movies with them. 2,225. I bottomed out after that because of AIDS. And I knew that if I continued on my partying ways, my Fire Island ways, that I would be dead. And so I had to regroup, get myself sober, get myself serious, and I did. I moved back to New York and got into an apartment where I was leading this very monastic, kind of very ascetic life. I had been living high on the hog. I'd made a movie called The Main Event. I made a lot of money. And during, the late 70s, I was, with the Saint at Fire Island, Studio 54. I was partying to it fairly well, and I had a blast, I must say. But in 1980, it got very, very dark, And you'd go to Far Island and you would see people walking around with stanchions so that their IVs would be dripping to their IVs. It was the most terrible thing. These young people who were so filled with so much talent and promise. I still today, all my best friends are dead. Every single one of them. Chris Adler, Bruce Weintraub, Fernando Scarfiore, Peter Lester. It's just such a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And people in the prime of their careers, Michael Bennett, I mean, these artists, think of what the world has lost because of this. And it's inconceivable. And in the middle of it, I thought, I was getting myself, on the straight and narrow, and I was frightened out of my mind. I was caring for my friends, washing their vomit, and pus was spurting out of their eyes. And, one of my friends, I'm having lunch with him, and blood starts spurting out of his gums. I looked down at the feet of one of my friends who was wearing shorts, and all of a sudden I saw like 1,000 little red spots, and I knew I went to medical school that it was idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, and I knew it, and I was so shocked by this, and you would be ravaged by these strange diseases and parasites and the pneumonia that you got, and people were walking around with, what do you call them? Nebulizers, and people were being, had cancers all over the place. It was the worst thing ever. And in the middle of it, I'm thinking to myself, well, I was wilder than any of these people. I'm going to get it. After AIDS, the white middle-class gay people who were afflicted with AIDS came together to take care of themselves because no one was taking care of them. So APLA was started out here. The Gay Men's Health Crisis by Larry Kramer was started in New York. Then AMFAR, it had two separate branches, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, and they started competing with each other. And it was David Geffen, I remember, went into a room one Sunday, and cracked the heads of these people and put together one national organization with Matilda Krim at the head of it. And people like David Geffen and Barry Diller and, were heroes who came along and started creating these organizations to help gay people in Hollywood. Sid Sheinberg, there were many, many heroes.
When I got CAS, there were lots of treatments for CAS. You could cut them out, you could radiate them, you could cover them with makeup for the CAS lesions, in the skin that were visible. None of them slowed down the growth of the CAS. They were all cosmetic. And my view was I was already spending enough time at doctors and everything else. I didn't want to waste any more of my life doing that. And there was if political is the right word, but it's who I was. I had AIDS, I had lesions. It announced my disease for me, which sometimes wasn't much fun, but it also, said I'm not a person who is ashamed of who I am. I'm not ashamed of having this disease. Having that, sort of visible, scarlet letter mark on me was challenging to the people in my life and people I'd run into casually or socially. And I felt that kind of challenge was exactly what was needed. I think, anyone who felt the need to disguise them or to cut them out or whatever, is certainly their choice. And I think no less of those people, but I'm somebody who was able to kind of carry it and let it serve a broader purpose. People were dying so fast and with such frequency, I don't know how old you are, Jeff, but but there was literally a time in the mid and late 80s, if you'd run into someone on the street you hadn't seen in a few weeks, and you had a mutual friend, you'd be afraid to ask about that mutual friend. You'd say, "Hey, how's Joe doing?" Because the answer might be, "Oh, didn't you hear? Joe's in the hospital. Joe died last week. Joe," that just in the space of a few weeks, it created this reluctance to follow up on mutual friends. The closest thing I've ever read that describes what it was like for people at the sort of front edges of the epidemic in those days, is Michael Hare's book Dispatches from the Vietnam War. That is the sort of what accurately sort of conveys the sense of what it was like to live your life and to, you know, be constantly surrounded with death and people dying, like everybody in your life. You know, Tim Dugos and I used to have a list we'd keep of people that were sick or people we heard were sick or whatever, and we would cross them off. You know, we talked to every single day, you know, and going over this, you know, all the people and the way they memorialized their friends and the Rolodexes with, you know, all the names crossed out, and going to the hospital, going to St. Vincent's Hospital to see friend A, and you'd be walking down the hallway looking at the names on the doors, because invariably you'd find friend B or friend C. You didn't even know they were hospitalized. You know, you could just walk around the AIDS ward and see and discover people you knew who were sick. Those first days of the epidemic, first few years of the epidemic, as horrific as they also were very beautiful in certain ways, and they showed the really most wonderful and best side of the LGBT community, because the existing healthcare delivery system wasn't serving us. It already wasn't serving us, and then with the epidemic, and you know, it made it even worse. So we had to take care of each other. So we had to create our own kind of like parallel structure, except we didn't do it in parallel. We did it in a very different way. We did it instead of the benefactor-victim model of most social service agencies, we created a partnership model where we were helping each other. Well, it was so apparent that the government didn't care. The president didn't even mention the word, you know, AIDS in any kind of public address until 1987. There was no sense of urgency with government agencies, you know, either at a local or federal level, or at the drug development process. You know, there was just you just felt this resignation that it's, you know, it's faggots and junkies, you know, let them go off and do what they do. And of course now, you know, looking back and documents that have been released since then, particularly in the Reagan White House, you see that this was a very specific strategy, you know, sort of a benign neglect that, you know, they'll just sort of, you know, die off. Many of us believed that was the case at the time, but we didn't have the proof of it that we have now. And of course, when we were saying that, even within the community, other people, you know, oh, well, they're doing what they can. You know, people want to believe the easy answer. They want things to be simple. We had, to a certain extent, a parallel healthcare delivery system amongst gay men already. It was not at all uncommon for gay men to have their regular doctor and then a clap doctor, which is what they used to call them, which is a doctor who just treated sexually transmitted diseases. Now, what happened with the epidemic is that those clap doctors became the experts on the epidemic. They saw the cases first. They saw most people. They knew what was happening. But even that was a problem, because many of them were closeted. You know, there was an incident here in New York early on in the epidemic when the New York Physicians for Human Rights, which was the gay doctors group, would not send out a warning to its membership about the epidemic because it would reflect poorly on the gay community. There's this whole, you know, thing around, you know, secrets and all going back to a real shame over the secret of gay male sexuality, of how gay men were having sex, whether it was the type of sex they were having, the frequency, the way we were creating relationships was so different, that was still cloaked in you know, enormously heavy blanket of shame. A lot of it that was reflected in just utter lies, that everybody's at equal risk. You know, it's going to, you know, just happen to by coincidence end up in the gay community. You know, all this stuff that's not true at all. You know, we had created a peculiar ecosystem amongst gay men that that, you know, sociologists and others will be able to explain better than I, but that came out of a hypersexual reaction to you know, a very long time of repression. The empowerment movement really dates to the Denver Principles being written in June of 1983. That was the first time. It was at I think it was the 5th annual Gay and Lesbian Health Conference was being held in Denver. And a few Bobby Campbell in San Francisco, Michael Callan in New York. There were few people with HIV who had gone public in the papers at that time. It's very unusual. And there was this health conference going on in Denver, and several people had the thought to, why don't we get together some of the activists from around the country working on AIDS stuff. And there was someone in New York who paid for the airplane tickets for several people from New York, Dan Turner and Bobby Campbell from San Francisco. And there were 12 or 13 guys at this conference. And they went off to a hotel room. These conferences, all the important things happen in hotel rooms. And they sort of talked about what was going on in their cities and decided to write a manifesto. And their first discussion was around language. San Francisco group in particular was concerned about the use of the word victim, and we needed to sort of take the language and define it. So they wrote this manifesto called the Denver Principles that began with saying victim implies helplessness, patient, we're only occasionally patients, we are people with AIDS. And what is historic about this manifesto was it was the very first time that people who shared a disease, any kind of disease, in the history of humanity, gathered and asserted the right to their voice, the right to participate in the decision-making that would so profoundly affect their lives. So this is what started the self-empowerment movement that was the sort of philosophical foundation of a lot of the community-created institutions that responded to the epidemic.
It all started in July of 1985 with the public disclosure that Rock Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS. He went public with it. And in New York at that time, the New York Post was a very sensationalistic paper. And they kind of got onto this story in a way that was both homophobic and AIDS-phobic. And they, to the exclusion of almost any other news, their front pages were consistently about this story. Rock Hudson, gay, AIDS, the equation between gay and AIDS, that it was a gay disease, in very unflattering terms, homophobic terms. And so Vito and this group of 8 got together probably that September around Alan Barnett's kitchen table. He was also one of the 8 founding members. And they just had an open conversation about what can the gay community do to counteract what's going on. And one of them, and I do not know who it was, came up with the idea of co-opting the media and using the media to inform rather than to be homophobic, to educate, rather than to scare people. And as a result of that meeting, they reached out to a few other people, and in November of that year, there was a town hall meeting down in Greenwich Village in a church, which was filled, it was literally filled to capacity, because by that point the community was angry and upset and not just a little bit frightened. The epidemic was really coming home to people in very personal ways, and they were extremely upset about what was going on in the New York Post. And it wasn't just the New York Post, but it was mostly the New York Post. So the purpose of this town hall meeting was to formally announce this organization to the city, but also to ask for volunteers for this street action, which was being planned for the following month, which was at the office of the New York Post. In 1985, it was not absolutely known for sure. They were coming close to the idea that it was a virus, and a virus knows no sexual orientation or identity. But because the epidemic landed first in the gay community, it gave a lot of homophobic people and institutions license to do what they wanted to do, to fan the flames. So the New York Post, wanted to sell newspapers, and the more sensationalistic the headlines, the better it was for them. And it's not necessarily that anything was based in fact or reality. It was about their ability to just, rev up their revenues. And particularly, initially it was all about Rock Hudson. But then they moved off of Rock Hudson and just, more general type things. And, building the case that, it was a gay disease, that, we were the enemy, that it was our fault. And, we just had to stand up and say no. The protest was held at the offices of the New York Post, which was downtown Manhattan, on a Sunday afternoon in early December. And I believe it was called Burn the Rag, something like that, because it was a rag. And the purpose of the meeting at the church in November was to get volunteers to work on the event, to get people involved, to get the word out. And there were probably between 800 and 1,000 people who actually showed up. And I think the Post was, they were certainly aware of the event. I don't think they knew what it was going to become or you know, if they were worried about it. I don't think they were happy about it. And it was basically, you know, your typical gay activist event with fiery speeches, with, you know, let's get people worked up. And the fact of the matter is people were worked up, and this gave them an outlet, you know, so that they could vent. And not, you know, and I'm not suggesting there was anything violent about it, because there wasn't, but there is something about raising your voice and shouting and yelling a little bit that makes people feel good. It wasn't just about the New York Post, although it was about the New York Post, but it was about what our responsibility as a community was to make sure that our stories were told fairly and accurately, which later became a watch cry for the organization. And then the coup de grace at the end of the event was that there was this big keg on which we placed rags and lit a torch and threw in the New York Post, and we burnt the rag. What our role became then was to monitor the media on a daily basis, and at that point we were only in New York City with extremely limited resources, meaning we had no money, we had no staff, we had volunteers. And if I remember correctly, there was a very generous woman who lived in Brooklyn Heights who opened up her apartment, and every Monday night we would be in her apartment, you know, plotting our strategy. We tried to establish ourselves as an organization that had something to offer the media. So it wasn't just about taking them to task for the bad things they did, but to attempt to educate them. For instance, back in 1985-86, the New York Times, for whatever reason, would not use the word gay. It was just something that was not in their lexicon. And the New York Times, which has become an extremely supportive newspaper for equal rights for the LGBT community, back then they tended to be a little more timid in how and when they would change, you know, their editorial choices. So one of the organization's first big accomplishments within a year or 18 months of its founding was to get the New York Times to agree to use the word gay, which we looked at as a major victory because, you know, it kind of brought them forward into the 1980s. This would have been in the spring of 1986, where William F. Buckley wrote an editorial in which he suggested that anybody who was HIV positive, and he was referring to gay people, should have a tattoo on their backside to that effect as a warning. And we thought that was way over the line, and we organized a street protest at his office, which also gathered some attention. I don't believe he ever really apologized for it, but that wasn't the point. The point was that we were not going to allow these things to happen, and we were going to use our best efforts, you know, to reach out and explain why it was wrong.
By the late 80s, the AIDS epidemic had really begun to dig down deeper into the next generation. And, you know, younger people at that time, people in their 20s, their early 20s, mid-20s, they still didn't have a real kind of sense of the scope of the epidemic, at least like most people in their 20s, out having a good time, and that was me at that time. I certainly wasn't political, I certainly wasn't involved in activism, and the previous generation, which of course was the first post-Stonewall generation, had already been politicized, and certainly were many activists who were involved in causes, and then of course AIDS had really energized people. ACT UP had formed really with a lot of the people from that previous generation coming together and saying we really need to do something about this and we really need to stand up and fight back. And it wasn't until really the second year or so of ACT UP that I think younger people started to come in and were themselves galvanized because they were getting sick, their friends were getting sick, and had really very little history of what went before. And so ACT UP was really a, you know, certainly for that next generation, a huge education in gay activism. What really motivated a lot of people to get involved and really take on the power structure, and take on politicians, and take on the media, was, I think, a sense that nobody was doing anything about the epidemic. Nobody was really doing anything to really try to change the course of the way things were going in terms of research, the way things were going in terms of how the media looked at the epidemic. And for a lot of people, that was obviously about themselves and personally how they experienced the epidemic. And for me, it was really about seeing a lot of people around me who were getting sick, people who were dying, and looking at the world I was in at the time, which was, entertainment, media. I was a publicist, and I was going out all the time to parties and Broadway shows and films, and very much in that world that was very gay and certainly very creative and very much about the arts. And yet, even in that world, there was a sense of keeping this hush-hush, a sense of, people would die and they would just disappear. There was still an enormous fear, and I think for a lot of us, it was just, we need to take charge of this. We need to really do something to change this. I can't just sit around and let this all be very quietly pushed under the rug. And I think it was the same thing, obviously, for a lot of people who themselves were infected with HIV at the time. They were either going to make a choice that they were just going to let it all play out the way it was playing out, with the government ignoring it, with the media sensationalizing it, with people not really doing anything beyond some people volunteering and doing caretaking. I think for a lot of those people, it was about, we need to now take control ourselves. AIDS brought a lot of the people out who, might not have ever come out of the closet, might not have ever stood up and done anything. So ACT UP was Wall Street stockbrokers and, executives, as well as feminists, as well as, African-American activists and, people who worked in theater and people who worked in film and people who were in conservative politics. I mean, it brought together for the first time these people, because AIDS didn't discriminate in terms of who was infected with HIV and who was affected by HIV.
I imagine that new generations will come out for new aspects of the cause. Unless we reach a point where it doesn't matter at all anymore. I mean, feminism has reached a point where you don't see women's demonstrations anymore, and the younger women are growing up choosing, whether to have children and whether to work and whether to wear makeup and the garments, the bras and girdles that were, well, girdles are gone, but the bras that women saw as oppressive, and now a lot of young women want to be femme and wear high heels and shoes that we all regarded as dangerous, so it may come to pass with gays that we're so accepted that we're not an issue.
So I feel that I've lived to see a revolution, and even though a lot remains to be done, I'm very grateful that I've lived to see the positive things that have happened. And the most significant of all is the creation of community. We were as many then as we are now, but we weren't connected to each other. Now many of us are connected to each other. We've created a culture and a community and an expression in the arts, and that has changed the world as much as politics, I think. The gay activism, the gay liberationists have given place to the gay politicians, and that's a good thing. It's much easier and infinitely more safe to pick up a telephone and lobby a gay politician than go storming into the office of a straight politician and face arrest. So I'm grateful for the change. But I think we should also be aware that something has been lost too.
When I speak on campuses, I talk to 18 and 19-year-olds who have had the last 7 or 8 years in school. If they've gotten any sex education, it's been abstinence-only education. They know so little about how to protect themselves. They are so disconnected from this history, and I feel like a lot of our own community has gone on to, I don't know, sort of, for whatever reason, more attractive, immediate things, whether it's marriage equality or the don't ask, don't tell stuff or whatever. And we never finished this work.